I like to always tell people the way to think about it is like an apple. So you have a good apple, it looks beautiful and shiny on the outside, but when you start eating it, you find out that it's rotten at the core. Everyone from the outside wouldn't know that it's rotten on the inside until they start eating it. So that's something that no one can see.
Like Snow White's poison
Yes,
apple, eh?
she was tricked.
She was tricked. Hi and welcome to the Property Pod. Today we're discussing the contentious 𝗃𝗧𝗀𝗀𝗧𝗀 clause and the new game-changing legislation that's been introduced by the Property Practitioners Act, in terms of which sellers are now required to sign a mandatory disclosure form. And joining me to explore this topic is Daniela Boonzaier from Araujo Attorneys. Hello, Dan.
Hi, Carol. Thanks for having me here.
Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
So Daniela is a conveyancing attorney. She is also a director at Araujo Attorneys. And what we love most about Dan is that she has a very client-centric approach to law. She's people-focused. She's relationship-driven. Her service is excellent. Her support is amazing. And she loves training. So she spends a lot of time imparting her knowledge on my team. And now she's imparting her knowledge on all of us. So thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, so let's begin with unpacking this new legislation. So essentially now there's a requirement on sellers to sign a mandatory disclosure form, but sellers don't panic because you're still protected by the 𝗃𝗧𝗀𝗀𝗧𝗀 clause. And buyers, this is actually really encouraging because it enables you to make more informed property decisions. So Dan, quickly, if you can just touch on this new legal requirement for us.
Absolutely, Carol. So the Property Practitioners Act obviously brought into effect that sellers now need to sign a mandatory disclosure form when they are selling a property. Buyers also need to sign that form. It is nothing new, essentially. So sellers, there was always the requirement for sellers that they had to disclose any defects on the property that they were aware of. So now the Property Practitioners Act has just tried to formalize that more and brought it out in a check sheet sort of format and said, okay, now the sellers need to actually go through the property and think about what they are aware of and write it down so that when a buyer comes to buy the property, they can then see, okay, I'm buying a property which is a second-hand good, and these are all the things that are potentially defects. No, I wouldn't want to say wrong with the property, but things that might sway my decision on what I'm offering for the property or buying. So it's nothing really new. It's just formalizing what was already there. The sellers are still protected by the 𝗃𝗧𝗀𝗀𝗧𝗀 clause. The onus is still on the purchasers to inspect a property that they would be potentially buying.
And I think that's really important, Dan, because nothing's changed. We've just actually made the environment more transparent, which is a really good thing. It almost brings ethics to the fore and it's preventing fraudulent non-disclosure, which is a fantastic thing. So what advice would you give to sellers when completing this disclosure form?
So I would just say honesty is key. Just to be honest, to be thorough. The more you actually put in that disclosure form, the better. So the more that you are aware of, I think sellers are a little bit nervous to put in things that they are aware of, even if it's something so small, like there's a crack in the window. They don't want to put that because they think that, oh, maybe the purchaser is not going to buy the property. But down the line, it would actually be worse for them if
they didn't disclose
these things, and then they were obviously aware of it because it's something that you could see or that they did know about. So my advice for sellers would be honest, put everything that you know about the property, even if you think it's so minimal, just
rather
put it in there.
And then Dan, what happens with investment properties? So absent landlords, sellers that have actually never lived in their homes. So it's quite tricky for them to kind of know about any defects.
Yeah, and that pops up quite often. And we'll often see mandatory disclosure forms that are blank, or maybe they just say NA, which we also don't like that the Property Practitioners Act have put that column in there because it's sort of a grey area. But we say to all our sellers that if it is their investment property, or if it's not and they just haven't ever lived there, or they're now overseas and they're trying to sell the property, put again the timeline when you were last in the property. So if it's your investment property, you say, I've had a tenant living in there or various tenants living in there over the past 10 years. I've never actually lived in there. The tenants haven't made me aware of anything. Or the tenants have only made me aware of XYZ in the last tenancy. Or if you live overseas and your house has been now vacant for maybe 1 or 2 years, say you've moved overseas, I'm now living in the UK and the property's been vacant for 2 years. Rather say that than say that you're not aware of anything. Essentially you are saying that, but rather just qualify it with be clear and qualify it with the fact that you haven't actually lived there. So then it's quite easy to then say to the purchaser, well, the seller hasn't actually lived here, so how would he know that it's leaking or the aircon's not working or whatever the case may be?
No, perfect. I think that's important. So essentially the big question is, does this mandatory disclosure form negate the 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗀𝗃 clause? And it sounds to me that the 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗃𝗀𝗧 clause is still very much in play. It's still protecting seller from any patent or latent defects. Where the disclosure form really comes into play is with known defects. So it's preventing fraudulent non-disclosure. And I think this is really critical because, as you said in the beginning, it hasn't actually changed the legal position. It's just formalized it. And so can 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗃𝗏𝗧 and the disclosure form live in harmony? And it appears that they can.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's what's great about it. And I think that's where the misconception is that people think it's two very different things. Whereas they do actually go hand in hand, and they can, like you say, live in harmony. The 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗃𝗏𝗧 clause is still there in law that the seller has to disclose any defects that they are aware of, and if they obviously weren't aware of any of those defects, then they are protected by the 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗃𝗏𝗧 clause. That checklist that the PPRA has now put into place, the mandatory disclosure, just makes it an easy tool for the seller to then list what is there and sort of get him to think about, oh yes, I actually am aware of these things. And then at the same time, the buyers then can see what they are purchasing. But at the same time, it's also no guarantee that the purchaser
absolutely
can't rely on it.
That is such a critical point. So at the end of the day, we're still dealing with secondhand property. It's not a brand new product. There are no warranties or guarantees that come with it. This is simply the seller saying, these are the defects that I'm aware of, but you still, Mr. Buyer, are buying my property as is in its current condition.
Correct. And again, I think a lot of the time the buyers have misinterpreted what that mandatory disclosure's purpose was. And they often say, oh no, but it's my rights under the Consumer Protection Act. And it actually is completely separate to that. So that mandatory disclosure form is not a guarantee by the seller. It's just an extension of the requirement that the seller would have under 𝗃𝗏𝗧𝗃𝗏𝗧 to say that they are aware of these defects, and the buyer, exactly like you say, would take that and then decide what they are willing to offer on the property or what they know to expect later down the line, and possibly to ask more questions, do more investigations. And the onus is still there on the purchaser to do their own inspections as they would have done before. So we often say to our purchasers, do your inspections before. In case you're unaware, you're more than welcome to do a home inspection. You can make a sale subject to a roof inspection, but obviously if your seller wasn't aware of it, you can't come back later and now say,
point fingers at the seller. So maybe we should just quickly talk about the 3 types of defects that crop up in property transactions. So first of all, you've got your latent defects, which are hidden. Then you've got your patent defects, which are obvious to the naked eye. And then you've got your fraudulent non-disclosure, which is where this new mandatory form comes into play.
So obviously your latent, like you said, it's your hidden. I like to always tell people the way to think about it is like an apple. So you have a good apple, it looks beautiful and shiny on the outside, but when you start eating it, you find out that it's rotten at the core. Everyone from the outside wouldn't know that it's rotten on the inside until they start eating it. So that's something that no one can see.
Like Snow White's poison apple.
Yes, she was tricked. So, but it's often not a trick for, the sellers are not trying to trick the purchasers. They genuinely don't see it. Let's hope. Then it would be the fraudulent non-disclosure. And then your patent defects are your ones that are visible. So the same scenario in the apple, but it looks rotten from the outside, or it's had a chunk bitten out of it. So you're not going to pick that one from the Apple store. So those, with the patent defect, those are visible. So obviously the onus is still there. The purchaser would walk into the property and see those.
Yes.
The seller wouldn't be fraudulent if it's obvious to the purchaser. They don't need to
actually write
They don't need to write all of it down. So
Yeah.
the mandatory disclosure form would more be defects that are latent that the seller is aware of.
Yes.
Then you get to your fraudulent non-disclosure, is where there's latent defects that the seller is aware of, but he has chosen not to disclose, and there's a fraudulent element to it.
And fraud is very difficult to prove because you've got to start improving intent. So you're looking at states of mind. And in law, it's a way more difficult route to follow than just trying to look at negligence, for instance.
Exactly.
Now you're talking fraud.
And it's a criminal offense. So essentially the purchaser would be accusing the seller of a crime.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it is. And it's quite difficult to prove someone's state of mind.
Yes.
So how do you prove that the seller actually did know that his roof was leaking?
And intentionally
concealed it.
Yeah.
He might have just thought that was the way it is. Another thing I also try to explain to buyers when they come up with these issues is that something that's good to one might not be good to another.
Yes.
So someone might be living in a home where it's obvious that every time it rains, the water comes through the door and now the bottom of the door is rotting. You can see that it's rotting and it's obviously because there's water damage. So the purchaser would see that the door is rotting, ask them, then the onus would be on the purchaser to say, I see the bottom of the door is rotten. What is that from?
Yes.
Not necessarily for the seller to say, every time it rains, it comes under the door and that's why you see that it's rotten and the door is swollen. But the purchaser might say, oh, well, they intentionally hid that and they were fraudulent because they know every time it rains, it comes through the door. So that's something that's visible. But obviously if they know that they've now redone their whole ceiling because in a huge thunderstorm, the wind blew everything off or there's a big leak, then obviously and they didn't disclose that, then obviously there's that fraudulent element.
No, for sure. Well, thanks, Dan. I think it's important that we've clarified this. So essentially the summary is the 𝗃𝗧𝗀𝗧𝗬𝗏 clause is still there to protect sellers, and the disclosure document is there just to give buyers a more informed decision.
Yes, correct.
So thanks, Dan. So the little summary version of everything is that 𝗃𝗧𝗀𝗧𝗬𝗏 is still there to protect sellers. The disclosure document now gives buyers a little bit more information that enables them to make informed decisions. So 𝗃𝗧𝗀𝗧𝗬𝗏 and mandatory disclosure actually do live in harmony.
Yes, correct, Carol. And like you said, I think it just gives, I would say the advice to the sellers would be honest. That mandatory disclosure form has given them a tool to put everything on there to actually protect them more. And then like you said, the buyers now have also a tool to be able to see what's going on at the property and then make an informed decision whether they want to buy the property or what they'll need to do to the property.
Super. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dan.
Thank you.
And where can people get hold of you?
You can get hold of us on our website, www.araujoattorneys.co.za, or follow us on our social media pages on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn.
Divine. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you for joining us today. I hope you did find this informative. I think it has been a very contentious issue in our business practice and a little bit of a grey area. So nice just to get some clarity. And we'll see you at the next pod.